Greetings, APUSH scholars, for our review for Unit 2 on the causes of the American Revolution and the American Revolution itself, looking at the review sheet from top to bottom here. What you need to know about the Puritans and the Great Awakening, and the Great Awakening appears a little farther down the review sheet, is that in the 1740s you have this Christian religious revival which leads to schism in the churches. And in a sense, this is practice revolution. Keep in mind, with the exception of Rhode Island, that in New England the churches are supported by various laws and supported by taxation. So the demand for religious freedom, to break away from a church, is not just a demand for religious freedom, but also a putting into practice political freedom, and it's a demand for political freedom. So there's this kind of preparation. There's a practice rebellion, as it were, in the churches, which is setting the stage, maybe psychologically, for the revolution which is coming down the road. Two of the famous preachers in Puritan New England that you should know are Jonathan Edwards, the author of the famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and George Whitefield, who preached in all of the colonies. The connection here with the Puritans is, and this maybe gets into a little bit of psychological history here, but there's this anxiety over salvation. Remember, the Puritans believed in election. The doctrine of election says that God chooses us, we do not choose him. So this is there's some introspection and perhaps some fear that the Puritans, their eyes have left the goal here of creating the city on a hill, that perhaps they haven't been as faithful as they should have been. This leads to this emotionalism, this leads to conversions, this leads to the desire for a repurification, as it were, of the Puritan faith. The Battle of Quebec, what you need to know about this is it is essentially the end of the French and Indian War. This is the battle where the French are going to basically surrender after this. Remember the painting, The Death of General Wolfe, where he has just defeated the French army, but he's dying from his wounds here on the Plains of Abraham, where the battle took place in Quebec. And most of the Indians did side with the French, but in this painting you have an Iroquois in the lower corner here. And remember, the Iroquois did join the British. So this is a turning point in American history, because that's after this battle, after this war, that the English are going to crack down on the Americans. And you have the end of what has been called salutary neglect. And the significance of salutary neglect is it's this period where the Americans, for a good 100 years, have ignored the Navigation Acts, have ignored the principle of mercantilism, and they've been trading with whomever they want for their own profit, for their own benefit. And the period of salutary neglect ends when the British began this crackdown on the colonists and demand that they pay the taxes that they should have been paying. They stopped smuggling, that they obey the Navigation Act, and this imperial debt, which is racked up at the end of the French and Indian War, begins to be imposed upon the Americans. The Proclamation of 1763, this is one of these beginning issues between us and the Brits. Pontiac, this Indian chief, is leading a rebellion along the frontier, along the Appalachian Mountain frontier, and it's in response to these relentless and endless land incursions of colonists who are crossing the mountains. And the British solution to these Indian attacks is to tell the Americans not to cross the Appalachians. Now, this probably seemed like a good idea in somebody's mind in London, that the Americans stand one side, the Indians won't attack and the Brits won't have to protect us. But the colonists are, they're not able to get deed to land. If they're poor, they're not able to sell it. If you're a rich speculator, a guy like Washington, and certainly the the colonial governments aren't able to collect taxes on land which, there's not free hold to. So there's also this lurking suspicion that the British are trying to control the Americans for their own purposes. The war here with Pontiac, similar to many other Indian wars, think of the Powhatan War in Virginia, and the Pequot War in Massachusetts, and the King Philip's War, all ultimately over this movement of white settlers onto Indian land. The Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is a revenue tax. It's a tax to pay for the cost of British troops in America, and it's what we call a direct tax. The Americans would see this tax at the point of sale on a daily basis. And the issue here is this idea of there should be no taxation without representation. Colonists have become accustomed over 100 years here of passing their own taxes, of voting on their own taxes, either at the local level or at a more colonial level, say the House of Burgesses, for example. And there's resistance because it's violating this American belief in self-government. And there is a repeal, not because the Parliament feels that the Americans have been wrong, but because the British merchants are protesting that they're losing a lot of money on the deal. Now, the Townshend Act is what's called an indirect tax, which the Brits are essentially calling our bluff. We have said that we will accept a tax that's collected at the point of deposit here of a ship that's unloading its cargo, and then the indirect tax that's sort of hidden in the price of goods down the road is legit for the purposes of paying for the protection of the British Navy, what it provides us, but the colonists really have no intention of paying any taxes, which they have not voted on. There's another boycott, which leads to another repeal. So the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, along with the earlier Sugar Act, these are all unpopular taxes because of they're without representation. Remember, the British say that we have virtual representation, that the Parliament is only treating us with our best interest in mind, and we're not buying it. The Boston Massacre in 1770 is a confrontation of young American men with young British soldiers who are at a garrison. It's on a winter's night here. The anger is over a number of things. There's the perception that Boston has been occupied by the British Army, even though there's no enemy in sight. You know, the French are long defeated and the Indians are not anywhere near. And there's the issue of the quartering of soldiers in private homes. There's the issue of scarce jobs, which British soldiers are competing for as they moonlight. And then there's this issue of taxation, and the British soldiers are not the most pleasant people to have in town, and this leads to colonists throwing things and the British soldiers shooting and killing 5 colonists. The Tea Act is this tax that's left after the Townshend Acts are lifted as a point of principle, and eventually the East India Company is given a monopoly to sell tea in the colonies, and the British the colonial reaction here is to take this British ship in Boston Harbor and to dump 45 tons of tea into the harbor. And again, it's a protest over monopoly. It's a protest against taxation without representation. The British shut down the port of Boston. They shut down colonial meetings and the legislature and courts. Essentially, Massachusetts is under martial law. The British call this the Coercive Acts, and the counter-reaction here of the Americans to the Intolerable Acts is the First Continental Congress, which is to protest this injustice. The Sons of Liberty, these are an American street mob, which, depending on your point of view, they are grassroots patriots who are harassing tax collectors, and tar and feathering them, and threatening them and breaking their windows and things like that, or else they're basically sort of hoodlums and using modern lingo, sort of terrorizing the legitimate representatives of His Majesty's government. John Locke, philosopher you should know. He is an Enlightenment thinker, an Enlightenment writer who says that the purpose of government is to protect our God-given, inalienable natural rights. And the state of nature that is exchanged for government is we are born free, but because some people abuse their freedom and say might steal and rob from others, what happens is we consensually, we voluntarily surrender some of our freedom, and we turn some of that freedom, some of that sovereignty over to a government on a provisional basis so that it protects us, so that it keeps us safe. So what we lose here in creating a government is some of our freedom, but what we gain is safety and protection. And that is conditional. That is, if the government does not protect us, then we have a right to get a new government. And this is, John Locke's ideas are going to be cribbed and put into the Declaration of Independence. And this is all very, very open. This is sort of state-of-the-art political thinking that's being discussed in the salons of France and in the tea houses of London. Thomas Paine is the author of Common Sense, and it's written after the battles of Lexington and Concord, and it's an emphatic call for independence. And Paine will point to the violence of the British government against the colonies. He'll point to the distance between the two places. He'll talk about differing interests. He'll point things out that the British monarchy is run by the grandson of a German king, and that a huge number of American colonists are not of British ancestry. So he's basically saying, why are we putting up with this? He's calling for independence. And this is very much a catalyst for taking a lot of the people who are moderate, the people who are reconcilers, and putting them in the camp of the patriots, those who want independence. Jefferson and slavery, note the contradiction. He is an opponent against slavery. He puts a complaint that the British have imposed slavery on us in the Declaration of Independence, and this is taken out by the committee before it goes for the vote. And one of the contradictions here, perhaps a hypocrisy, is that Jefferson, you may well know as a Virginian, owned slaves. The Great Awakening, we already went over that a few minutes ago, and Indians during the Revolution most sided with the British. And the Iroquois Confederation, which stood for 200 years or so, divided and was broken at the end of the Revolution. Most of the Indians took the British side, and essentially they lost when the British lost. And the British sell the Indians down the river. Their interests are ignored at the Treaty of Paris in 1783, when the British basically surrender all of the land between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River to the colonists. And this is land that's largely inhabited at this time by the Native Americans. Issues and incidents leading to the Revolution, no details. Do look over your notes. Okay, you've been watching some online videos, been reading your book. You should be familiar with the significance of and the consequences of and the details of the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Writs of Assistance, Admiralty Courts, the Quartering Act, the Townshend Act, the Tea Tax, the Intolerable Acts, the Prohibitory Act, the Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, the burning by the British Navy of Falmouth, which is modern-day Portland, Maine, and Norfolk, Virginia. And these burnings of these two ports are long before the Declaration of Independence. British strategy and war measures. Remember, there is, after the British leave Boston, after Bunker Hill, they are going to try to divide the colonies, drive a wedge by the British occupation of New York City. And the third and last stage is the British government will move down to the south to try to take advantage of Southern loyalist support. And the turning point of the war in all history books is pretty much the Battle of Saratoga, which is after a victory in upstate New York. The French decide to join the American revolutionaries, and backing us a little bit of revenge for the loss in 1763 of Canada and New France. And after Saratoga, the French will send us troops. Think of Lafayette. They will send us ships to help protect our shores. They will send us money, give us a line of credit in Europe, and they send us weapons. So this is kind of the short version of a quick review of some of the things that are specifically going to be on the test. Do look over your notes, and I've got the PowerPoints listed not listed, I've got them on Moodle if you want to look at those. And study hard, and good luck.